Okay, well, why don't we get started?
Sounds
And
good. Thanks, Asher.
we've got a full house, and I wish we had a chance to hear from everybody. We won't get a chance to do that, but we have folks joining us on Zoom here, and we've got others who are joining us through a YouTube live stream. So welcome everyone. My name is Asher Miller, and I'm the executive director of Post Carbon Institute, the host of today's conversation. Thank you all for joining us. I also want to thank Kumi and Lyla June for joining us today. This is a kickoff of sorts for a series of deep dive explorations that Post Carbon Institute will be hosting over the coming months. So I'm just going to do very, very brief introductions. Lyla June Johnston is an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer of Dene, Cheyenne, and European lineages. Her multi-genre presentation style has engaged audiences across the globe towards personal, collective, and ecological healing. She blends her study of human ecology at Stanford, her graduate work in Indigenous pedagogy, and the traditional worldview she grew up with to inform her music, perspectives, and solutions. Nice to see you, Lyla.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Asher.
Yeah, and then Kumi, welcome Kumi. For over 40 years, Kumi Naidoo has been a voice among many for social, economic, and environmental justice. From his humble township upbringing in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa to his work as an anti-apartheid activist to his leadership of international NGOs, Kumi has remained rooted in Martin Luther King's creative maladjustment principles, refusing to normalize inequality and devoting himself to exposing injustice. Welcome, Kumi. Before we dive in, I want to do some quick housekeeping and context setting. We plan to leave time at the end for Q&A, though I'm afraid we might not be able to respond to everyone's questions. We did receive and review hundreds of questions that came in advance, lots of really wonderful and difficult questions that we won't get a chance to address. I should also mention that a number of the questions we got relate to some of the topics that we're going to be hosting deep dives on later. So if you've asked one of those questions, I promise you we will try to address some of those topics. If not today, then another event. So if you do have questions that you'd like us to address, you can submit them by typing it in the Q&A window. Also, if you have thoughts or resources that you think are valuable to share, or you'd just like to say hello to the other participants, you could do so in the chat window. Both of those can be accessed by clicking on the buttons at the bottom of your screen. I also want to take a minute to acknowledge those who aren't able to be with us, the great many humans around the world for whom the opportunity isn't available, but who are or will experience the unraveling of environmental and social systems at least as much as us. That includes future generations and the trillions of other living beings that we share this planet with. Um, so I'm going to jump in. I'm eager to hear from Kumi and Lyla June, but I thought actually it would be helpful to provide just a little bit of context first. So I'm going to share my screen for 1 second, or a couple of minutes, I should say. Hopefully everyone can see this. Okay, so, um, context, especially for those listening in who aren't very familiar with what we mean by the Great Unraveling or terms like polycrisis. Uh, though the Great Unraveling, coined by the eco-philosopher Joanna Macy, may sound dark or worrying, and welcoming people to it could sound cavalier, we at Post Carbon Institute feel it's really critically important to be honest about where humanity now finds itself. Both a reality that we are likely going to be experiencing worsening environmental and social crises, and that this journey, while unavoidable, presents opportunities for reshaping our relationship with one another and the larger web of life. So, what are the environmental and social systems that are unraveling? Well, different people may include or emphasize different elements. For example, climate breakdown is viewed by many as the predominant crisis that we face. But what matters more than ranking or prioritizing specific concerns, at least in our view, is recognizing three things. First, we are dealing with a polycrisis of multiple environmental and social crises at the same time. Each crisis has its own complex dynamics that make it difficult to predict. But just as important is that they interact with one another, and so we have to respond to them collectively. Second, because these crises interact with one another, we face the risk of cascading failures. For example, climate breakdown will likely lead to migration of people and crop failures in some parts of the world, which could in turn lead to social upheaval in countries or regions which are otherwise less directly impacted by the climate system. There's no escaping, there's no putting up borders, there's no protecting ourselves. The dynamics of these cascading crises and our inability to respond to them in a systemic and fundamental way could well lead to collapse. So third, I just want to share that while there are no solutions to this problem that will allow us to return to what's been widely perceived as normal, at least in quote unquote modern societies in recent generations, a normal of ever-growing consumption and human population, economic activity, technological advancements, and exploitation of people in the more than human world, we are dealing with a predicament. This requires us to constantly adapt in response and fundamentally transform virtually every aspect of modern life. So what does that mean for all of us individually and collectively? I would argue it means building resilience in two areas on three levels. First is the inner work, which involves deepening our own understanding of why and where we find ourselves, especially as things change. Building our own emotional resilience so that we could stay in that difficult space of both accepting the great unraveling and still feeling agency. And finally, it means taking action in whatever ways work for our individual circumstances, our skills, and our passions, which leads to the outer work, which can and should take lots of different forms, whether that's working on rebuilding local vibrant economies, regenerative food systems, mutual aid networks, or shifting the cultural narratives of society, and doing so at the household, community, and planetary scales. Just like the relationship between environmental and social crises, the relationship between aspects of the inner and outer work interact and can be mutually reinforcing. So not everyone is in a position to engage in this work, and certainly not all aspects of it. But the fact that you are here with us today or viewing this recording means that you're already on this collective journey, or at least dipping your toes in, which is great because we need you. And that is why we are launching at Post-Carbon Institute Resilience Plus, which is a special membership area of resilience.org, featuring relevant and unique content, ways to meet and interact with others in this community, and a series of deep dive explorations on key aspects of how we can navigate the great unraveling. So we've asked Kumi and Lyla to join us today as a way of orienting ourselves to this shared journey. And so I'd like to turn it to the two of you. And I want to start with you, Lyla. Let me stop sharing my screen. Oops, for a second.
There should be like a red button
I
up.
got it.
Yeah.
There we go. Sorry about that.
All good.
Okay, so Lyla, obviously I could have spent a lot more time. I was just barreling through that there, unpacking the various environmental and social crises that we face, what the drivers are of the great unraveling or how things may play out. But I'd much rather broaden our perspective. So how would you describe the predicament that we face differently than maybe how I have put it? And why would you say, do we find ourselves here in this moment?
Well, first of all, thanks, Asher, or Asher. I think you put the
Yeah, you
this is
got
on
it.
the
Thanks.
air. Asher. Sorry, I was just learning that today. Asher. Thank you for that beautiful presentation and your beautiful heart. It's really nice to just see your vision of it as well, and the ways in which you're trying to really organize us for a great shift. And I think part of organizing people for the Great Shift is honoring all the different ways that we can organize. And I one time did an experiment getting 30 Dene people together, which is my nation, my mother's nation, Dene people who are indigenous to New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. We're also incorrectly known as Navajo. And I'm specifically from the Nanisht-Eje-Tachitni clan, which I get from my mother. And I asked these 30 people, I said, if you could teach and learn anything, what would it be? Because we were trying to create our own summer school. And I thought I was being very charitable by asking them, what do you want to see in this school? And honoring their agency and stuff. But what I realized, I was actually doing myself a charity because they had so many great ideas and they were coming back with so much amazing wealth of experience and information. And this experiment in community decision making actually enriched me more than I was enriching them. And so I think similarly, just like you're casting the issue and the solutions so beautifully in your own way, which obviously you and the Institute have worked very hard to create. You didn't just kind of come up with it in a day, but it's been an accumulation of decades of shared work between you and your team. There's also a million different ways each culture would present the problem and the solution. And so I think part of the solution for me is bringing together all of our solutions, bringing together all of our perspectives across the globe, because what someone in Tanzania from the Maasai Nation is going to say is different from what the Mebengokre in Brazil are going to say, which is different. What the Mardu in Australia are going to say is different. What the Gazignon in Thailand are going to say. And they're all beautiful. They're all important. And they all have a special gift to contribute. Specifically myself, I think that I really like how you sort of categorize certain things as the inner and the outer, and the social versus the technological and the practical. I think for me, the way I see it is that well, there's lots of different ways I could talk about, but from my traditional cultural worldview as Dene people, we have already been through the destruction of 4 worlds. And so we're calling this the 5th world. And so we are no stranger to collapse. We are no stranger to unraveling. And each time that a world collapses, we are forced to evolve or die. And so this is actually, for better or worse, from a Dene perspective, right on time. We've been prophesizing this for a long, long time. And so one of the worlds, in fact, the first world was destroyed by a flood. Interesting, right? Like way out here in the deserts of New Mexico, we have the same story of a flood, which they also have in Mapuche culture in South America, and they obviously also have in biblical culture. Around the world, this flood is known to have happened. And you can call us crazy, or you can just say, what a coincidence that all these cultures around the world talk about a flood. And other worlds unraveled for other reasons. But the point is that our people, we kept a record of this. We kept a record of what happened. And we know that part of this world, what is baked into it is trial and erudition. My elder Filmer Bluehouse said, you learn through trials here. That is what planet Earth is partly about. It's what we came here to do. And so I'll just give a brief example and then I'll pass it off to you. Chaco Canyon is a very famous archaeological site in New Mexico. And we were dabbling in hierarchy, caste systems, slavery. Its height was in around 900 AD to 1100 AD in what we now call New Mexico. And it was a huge city with these 5-story buildings. And it was a really big pre-colonial pre-Columbian city. And at a certain point, the whole thing collapsed around 1100. And this was actually our gift. This was actually our erudition. It was our trial, and it was our in other words, it was our hardship, and it was our learning. And they say creator sent us a drought to give us the courage to change. Because, for example, we find hundreds of thousands of logs that were used to build these buildings, that the strontium isotopes are the same from the Chuska forest, which is 100 miles away. So somebody was carrying hundreds of thousands of logs for 100 miles back in the year 1100. And it wasn't the high priests who were carrying those logs, if you see what I mean. It wasn't the people in the higher castes. It was the people in the lower castes, so to speak. And at a certain point, when the drought hit and the youth rose up, they said, no more. We're done with this. And it's baked into our creation story, the time when Chaco Canyon collapsed. And now when you go to our tribes, our clans are all equal. They're all Hanagatnis equal to Kiaanis, equal to Torachitni, equal to Tachitni. They're all seen as not only equal, but contributing their own gift. And we believe that it is through that collapse and that destruction of this city of Chaco Canyon that we became egalitarian. We became wiser. We became stronger. So sometimes collapse is your best friend to get you to wake up. So that would be my understanding and my framing. I could give others, but I'll leave that for now, is that right now we are dabbling in caste system. We are dabbling in hierarchy. We are dabbling in classism, racism, et cetera, patriarchy. And it is not working. It never was meant to work here. Only love works here. Love is what works on planet Earth. Everything else is temporary. Love is sustained, hierarchy collapses, period. That's just how it's always been. And when we are in this little snippet of history, it's hard to see. It looks like hatred works, right? It seems like hatred's working pretty good for some people. But when you zoom out on a geological time scale, hatred only survives for a little bit and then it dies out. And so we are in that process. And that's sort of how my elders have portrayed the issue and the solution.
Thanks, Lyla. That was great. Kumi, I want to give you a chance to either respond to things that Lyla had shared, or if you want to reframe kind of how I presented, or how you would say the predicament is that we're facing, how we respond to it.
So thank you very much for having me. I'm reminded of a moment during the liberation struggle in South Africa. If you followed a brilliant presentation like what we just heard from Lyla June, you started saying, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been eloquently made by the previous speaker. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 2 hours. But let me start.
You don't have 2 hours. Sorry.
Yeah. So let me say that all resonated with me. So let me just add a few things. So, there's a language in South Africa called Afrikaans, which is derived from the Dutch language. And I'm going to use a sentence from there and give you my one-line reading of where the world is at the moment. And I hope, even though you don't speak Dutch or Afrikaans, that you'll know what the sentence means. I think if we are brutally honest, some people say that we are in a convergence of crises, a boiling point, a perfect storm, and so on. But this one sentence that I would say, ons is deep, deep, deep in the dark. Okay, I hope that translates it somehow for all of you. So the moment of history that we find ourselves in, let me just start with this note. The moment of history that we find ourselves in is one in which pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that legitimately might arise from our observations, our analysis, and our lived experience can, must, and should be overcome by the courage, the creativity for our thought and our actions. Now, the universe has been telling us that we are in a deep crisis for quite some time. And each time the universe speaks to us, we don't respond. Let me take 3 events. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, which led to the contagion that spread to Russia and Argentina and so on. At that moment, Bill Clinton as president, Wilkinson as the president of the World Bank, and Kofi Annan as Secretary General of the United Nations all said in multiple speeches in the late 90s, the world needs a new international financial architecture. Right? I don't know whether many of you remember that phrasing. So it was a recognition that our systems were broken. Then 2008, 2009 financial crisis happens. Again, the brokenness of our systems, whether it be primarily the economic system, but also all the systems that flow from it, energy, and why I pick on energy specifically, because it's so fundamentally related to climate. So, for example, in the G20 meeting in London in 2009, in the height of the crisis, the G20 leadership said, we will be scrapping fossil fuel subsidies, which were in the tune of trillions of dollars, right? This is taxpayer money that goes to oil, coal, and gas companies. And did they do that? Of course they didn't. In fact, subsidies have stayed at roughly the same level, have even increased in the light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So you had very much a approach of sorry, let me just say that COVID then was the third big moment. And COVID also showed how our systems are just not serving the majority of people on the planet, right? And if you look at it, you know, COVID introduced a very interesting set of words, which I thought how essential workers, this term, essential workers, who to a large extent are invisible to policymakers and to the middle classes of the world, right? Suddenly we discovered actually the people who are most essential for our survival is not people who we pay the most amount of money to, but it is people who are road sweepers, who pick up our garbage, who serve in our supermarkets, and so on. But after each of these 3 crises, what was the response of those in power, right? Those in power responded with an approach of system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance. What was needed in each of those 3 cases instead was system innovation, system transformation, and system redesign. And some of you might remember there was a term that was used towards the end of the worst effects of COVID, which has completely disappeared. And that term was build back better. However wishy-washy build back better was, but he did suggest that we cannot just build and maintain the system that we have. But as you hopefully agree with me, that language has completely, moved away. So yeah, when I look at the moment that we are in, I'm very inspired by something that Martin Luther King said when I was a 4-month-old baby. He said, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there is a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to be well-adjusted and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to. He then goes on to say, I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, to racial discrimination, and on the economy, he says, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. If that was relevant to the United States in 1965, it is 1,000 times more relevant to the United States as well as virtually every country around the world today. In a longer version of the speech, he then said, I now call upon decent men and women around the world to come together to set up a new international movement that was never set up, to be called the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. So right now, to all of you attending, I say the challenge for all of us is to be creatively maladjusted, not to accept a broken status quo, and to search in a bold way for structural and systemic ways of responding to the crisis. To a large extent, what philanthropy does, and I have upset a few people by saying there's very little philanthropy in the world, there's just a lot of philanthropy, Fool, where we're fooling ourselves, we're to a large extent, we're treating the symptoms of the problem rather than the root causes. But I would conclude this bit by saying that for those of us who have been involved in social change for a long time, there's probably another proverb that we should visit right now, and that is the words of Albert Einstein, when he said, when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. And I want to say to you, wherever you are sitting, close your eyes for a minute and just ask yourself, does that definition apply to my life and what I've tried to do in my activism and my work? And I will tell you, I can proudly say, if somebody asked me whether I meet that definition of insanity, I would put my hands up, right? I might have done everything in good faith and with good intention, but the reality is we have to ask ourselves the question right now. What can activism do to be able to win bigger and faster? And I want to conclude with the words of Lyla June in a wonderful TEDx talk that she did some time ago, where the main thing I took away from it was what we are missing in our approaches is that we are not designing for perpetuity, right? Those in power right now sort of almost govern in a way that there are no generations coming after us. I mean, just stop for a moment and think, if oil, coal, and gas, fossil fuels were not causing climate change, assuming that it didn't contribute to climate change, should we be designing our energy system on something that by definition is going to be finite? We live on a finite planet. On some point in history, we're going to run out of oil, coal, and gas. And of course, we've run out of a lot of easy to reach oil, coal, and gas. And that is why now we are drilling in the Arctic and so on. So the moment where we are in, especially looking at the rise of fascism in the United States and elsewhere, is one which could lead us to have a sense of not having enough hope. But let me tell you what gives me hope in the moment we find ourselves in. In more than 4 decades of activism, I cannot remember any moment in that period where the appetite and the enthusiasm for substantive, fundamental, structural, and systemic change has never been as high as it is right now. I'm not saying it's as high as it needs to be, but I am saying it is higher than it's ever been before. And that gives me the energy and the optimism to continue to wake up every day and continue to fight. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumi. One thing that strikes me from what you shared is just a recognition of, we talk a lot about resilience at Post Carbon Institute and are focusing a lot on helping people build their own resilience and community resilience, but recognizing how resilient in some ways is this system that we're currently in. You've talked about multiple episodes where they could have served as a reflection point, a turning point for us. And somehow the system sought to restabilize itself and double down. And I think that that's something that people are really challenged to try to grapple with. I know I certainly am. You know, how do we fight or help create a real transformation when the system is so rigid and really wants to sort of bounce back itself? But I want to turn to you, Lyla, and I'm going to field some questions actually that we got submitted from people in advance. So one of them is, how does our perception of humanity as a species and our role on Earth influence how we affect the world around us? What is the difference between the Eurocentric post-Enlightenment era conception of the human versus some traditional indigenous conceptions of the human?
I think the way that we view and understand the human and the role of the human has profound effects on how we treat each other, how we treat the world, how we treat ourselves. For example, in Denebazad, my mother's language, the word for human is Nahokadi Yindene, which means sacred earth surface being. And by designating ourselves as sacred, we are implicitly saying, among other things, that we belong here. We're meant to be here. And a lot of my dissertation and the TED Talk and all that was talking about how humans have managed to be here in not only ways that didn't harm the earth, but in ways that extraordinarily benefited the earth, and in ways that created beauty and biodiversity and balance all around us. The Yoruba word for human being, it translates to chosen one. And a Yoruba elder at the Parliament of World Religions said that we're not chosen to be above or to be so important. He said we were chosen to steward the earth. We were chosen to, that was our job, was to be of service to the earth and take caretakers of the earth. And many different cultures around the world say that Creator put us right here, wherever that culture is, to protect this homeland. And so the notion, the Eurocentric, the I like to say post-Enlightenment Eurocentric, because Europe hasn't always been like this, right? Europe hasn't always had this reductionist, mechanistic, atheistic way of thinking. That's actually rather new for Europe. Prior to that, they were the goddess culture. You know, they find these 40,000-year-old effigies of women in German soil. Back in 2009, they found this 40,000-year-old clay effigy, which they find throughout Europe, you know, the Venus, as it were. But Europe is actually very much such an indigenous culture that's been sort of paved over by the Napoleons and the Alexanders, but that's all quite new. But the post-Enlightenment Eurocentric view of the human is that we are dominators. Either we're dominators or we're like a pest, right? We're like a problem. We're like an aberration. We're like an outcast or a misfit of creation. We're like this accidental stain on the pristine beauty of nature, right? And whether you see yourself as a pest or the other extreme as the best, the top of the food chain, the most important, survival of the fittest, blah, 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 you're missing, I believe, the true nature of the human being, which is that we are neither above nor below. We are equal, and we are here by design. We are here with purpose. We are here to be of service. And so a lot of my research details the ways in which humans have overseen 6,000-year-old clam gardens, 2,000-year-old oyster estuaries, 10,000-year-old abalone farms in the Channel Islands, the 6,000-year-old eel farm in the Gunditjmara peoples of Southern Australia, the ways in which the Kazignon people in Thailand have cared for the forests for thousands of years. and all the ways in which we have actually been this great asset to the ecosystem around us. So I think a huge part of the problem of our current conception is that humans are a problem, when in fact we are the yin, we are sacred, we are nahokati, we are earth surface beings. Creator placed us here with great purpose. And that purpose comes alive when our culture is driven by certain values, such as reverence, respect, reciprocity, relationality, this notion that we are a relative to all things, regenerative behavior, humility, truth, love. When we are governed and guided and spurred by those principles, we're actually quite wonderful. And we have the capacity to really have a green thumb. And our job here is to serve a species outside of our own. And so I think there's certain things that elevates the human spirit. There's serving and supporting women, that elevates us on a spiritual level. Serving and supporting children elevates us. Serving and supporting elders elevates us. And a big one, which Saint Francis de Assisi was no stranger to, is serving and supporting plants, animals, even down to the tiniest microbe, thinking out, not just outside of ourselves, but outside of our species. When we serve and create these bird baths, when we create these clam gardens, when we make sure that the oak is spaced properly so it doesn't choke itself out, when we make sure that the milkweed is growing so that when the butterflies come back on their migration, they have something to eat, we are elevating ourselves spiritually. We are stepping into our true power. We are stepping into our true purpose. And we are reclaiming our ecological role. And there's been so many instances where humanity has become a keystone species, a species upon which entire systems depend. And that was our job, that was our honor, and that was our role. And so many, many native nations name themselves after the land, the people of the Black Flint, the people of the Middle River, the people of the Pohwen. And so we name themselves according to the lands that they were placed to protect and to be the guardians of. That became their identity. How they saw the human was, we are the people of this place. We need to continue with that instead of what we've been doing sometimes. We name the land after us. This is Washington. This is Louisville. This is what do they call it? Queensland or whatever. It's ridiculous. Where you have to have compassion because people get confused, they get all kinds of confused. But ideally, we will come back to this place where we do not name the land after ourselves, but we name ourselves after the land. And that becomes our identity. And we can start small. And what I would suggest to everyone here is create a bird bath in your front yard, in your wherever, maybe you have an apartment, put it there. Watch the birds come and drink, watch them come and bathe. Or you can make a bee bath. Bees need water too. You put pebbles in a bowl and you fill it halfway because the bees have a hard time drinking because they're, they get stuck in the water. So when you have the pebbles, they can sit on the pebbles and drink. Sounds simple. It sounds silly. It sounds maybe trivial, but this gets us into the action of serving beings outside of our own species. And when we do that, that is one of the highest things that we can do. And Saint Francis de Assisi understood that. And that's how he attained his sainthood, was through his service to plants and animals and other beings. And so I highly recommend people start with that and start practicing what it looks like to serve. Some lizards got caught in the netting here. I cut them out and set them free. It sounds silly, but practice experimenting with the notion that all of these beings are just as important as your own grandmother. And when we get to that space, we will finally be truly civilized.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I really appreciate to me, it feels like a bit of a challenge for myself because sometimes I'll admit I can be despondent about what humanity is doing. I can become fatalistic or feel like it's sort of hopeless. And you spoke to that earlier, Kumi, the pessimism. And same thing about thinking about humans as being a pest, or some people call us a virus, and to recognize that we're actually an important part of the global ecosystem and have a role to play in service, I think speaks to maybe a path forward for each of us. So, and I also really appreciate you bringing it down to such a granular level. Kumi, I want to turn it back to you. So this is a question that we got from an audience member or someone they submitted in advance. So I'm going to read it for you. I know that I want to change my worldview, but how do we get others to see a different way of being when so many people remain loyal to their identities and ideologies, some of which are harmful to people and planet? How do we bridge with people who we disagree with? How do we get them to see the seriousness of this polycrisis and find points of connection and move us forward in healthy ways?
Thank you. Before I take that on, just a brief reflection to Lyla's comments. I was reminded as you were speaking about the fact that when I was at Greenpeace, our ship that was bombed by the French intelligence service in 1985 in New Zealand, Aotearoa, was called the Rainbow Warrior. And the reason it's called the Rainbow Warrior is that a native elder from the Cree people in the northern parts of Turtle Island is Eyes of Fire. She said, there will come a time when the trees will disappear, where the fish will turn up dead in the sea, on the rivers, our waters will go black, and so on. And when that time happens, a group of people from around the world, irrespective of race, religion, creed, and so on, to respond to white man's greed, will come together to try to heal the earth, and they will be known as warriors of the rainbow. And I say this to say that it goes back to one of the most troubling words for people who've lived under colonization, has been the word civilized, right? And I guarantee you, if all of us in this room, in this conversation, were the last people left on the planet, right? That climate change happens in the worst case scenario, and we are in a conversation somehow magically, and some amongst us says, you know what, let's write the history of the planet down and put it in a capsule so that if life emerges again, we won't make the same mistakes. I guarantee you that one of the things that we will actually agree on, if we think about it, is that those that were described historically as backward, primitive, civilized, and so on, were actually the most civilized in the genuine sense, most holders of real, deep, and fundamental wisdom, and who understood for millennia that humanity's presence on Earth is one where we need nature to survive in a fundamental way, on a whole range of, even in terms of our mental health. Nature is a critical part of maintaining our mental health and so on. So with regard to how do you change the worldview of those that disagree with us, there's a very short answer to that, and that is with extreme difficulty, right? I think right now, this is one of the biggest challenges that we have, and I want to say a few things here. In the 1970s, there was a French sociologist, a neo-Marxist called Louis Althusser, who was brilliant to the point where he was eventually declared insane. But at the height of his intellectual powers, Althusser wrote that one of the mistakes that we sometimes make in our analysis of the world is that, in fact, people are controlled and manipulated and dominated primarily through the repressive state apparatus, by which he meant army, police, use of formal laws, and so on. What he contended was, while recognizing the repressive state apparatus is very powerful in determining the space for political life and public life more generally, that the real threat, the real danger we face is actually not the repressive state apparatus, but what he called the ideological state apparatus, by which he defined as frameworks for education, for religion, for the funding of arts and culture, and most importantly, the frameworks for communications and media. So today, when we look at how do we shift public opinion towards where we need ourselves to be as a species on this planet, then we find that we have to recognize that incremental tinkering is not going to get us where we need to be, and that we have to rethink our relationship with nature in a fundamental way. And, you know, I've sort of upset a few people sometimes by saying, we don't need to save the planet. The planet is just fine, right? Because if we think about the trajectory that we're on, if we continue to warm up the planet the way we are doing, our soil gets destroyed, our water resources get depleted, we cannot grow food in parts of Africa which are becoming depopulated as we speak, because people can't grow food because it's got so hot and so limited water. The end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And the truth be told, everybody who's concerned about saving the planet, when we become extinct as a species, the oceans will recover, the forests will grow back, and so on. So don't worry about the planet in that sense. Understand that the struggle that we find ourselves in really is about protecting our children and their children's future in a way. And so let's look at the problem, though. We have two problems with rising to this challenge that this question poses. One's an objective challenge and one's a subjective challenge. The objective challenge is that the means of communication today, the means of being able to raise awareness, educate people about the crisis that we find ourselves in, spread the notion of urgency and so on, is all stacked against us. It's either state-owned media or corporate-owned media. And yes, social media, as we've seen, has served the right recently much better than it has served progressive folks. And so we got a problem with just the nature of the communications environment and who controls it. It's the very people who are upholding the very systems that are killing us on this planet are the ones that control the media environment. But for a minute, let's assume that we had more equitable access to the communications environment in its multifaceted and multi-layered manifestations. I would say that we would screw it up even if we had better access to the media, right? And there's a very simple reason for that. If we look at most of those who are seeking change and pushing change, and the climate struggle is a really good example for this, is most of our messages, our logics, our persuasions are all aimed at the head, right? It's facts, figures, science, policies, and so on. And we completely ignore the heart, body, and soul. And people do not get moved by facts and figures alone, right? And I hate to say this, but Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and the ilk actually understand this much better. And they've opted to ignore the brain completely, dump lies after lies after lies, and go straight to the heart and weaponize hate. And Lyla's comments in her opening statement, where she talked about love is the most resilient thing, is what I fully support. But right now, in the moment we find ourselves in, it's very tempting for us to actually say, the people who voted for Trump, the people who voted for Brexit, the people that voted for Bolsonaro, the people that voted for Modi in India and so on are just bad people, or as Hillary Clinton stupidly named them, deplorables, right? That was like one of the worst things that I think any person could have said. Right now bear me out. I have said that if we are going to win, we're going to need to learn to love the people that voted for Trump and see their humanity, understand why so many of them who 4 years earlier had voted for Obama, right? Why did they move in that direction? And that is also recognizing the brokenness of our political systems. I mean, in the United States, for example, which sees itself as a promoter of democracy, my God, what a horrific democracy. This is democracy. I remember Julius Nyerere, the founding president of Tanzania, was once asked about one-party system and two-party systems and so on. And he said, well, in most countries, you have one party that represents the interests of capital and another party that represents the interests of labor. And he said, the United States, though, is also a one-party state because you have both parties representing capital, and then says, but in typical American extravagance, they have two of them. He said it's also a one-party state, but in typical American extravagance, they have two of them. So I want to give you a practical example of how to respond to this, right? So let's say all of us in this conversation decided that the economic system was broken, unjust, had to be changed, and we say, let's launch a campaign 2 weeks from now, right? And let's say the slogan that we came up with could be something like, let's smash the capitalist system. Now, just look at my hands, right? I'm going to play a continuum for you. Assuming all those of us who think that the economic system requires deep, fundamental, and structural change are here, and all those who disagree with us are on a continuum away from us, right? Do you know what happens the day we launch the campaign? The day we launch the campaign, we've pushed people even further away from us, because whether we like it or not, there are millions and millions of people, even if they have exploitative jobs at Walmart, at Amazon, at any fast food place or whatever, they feel they've been led to believe that they are part of the capitalist system because they've got an exploitative job that they have to spend a lot of hours. So what would be a bridge building narrative instead? If we were to say, let's build an economy that includes everybody and doesn't harm the environment. Maybe it doesn't sound as sexy as let's smash capitalism, but it's offering you a bridge for a conversation and an engagement with the people that are not with us already. And far too often, I believe activism has become obsessed with showing to itself and to the people within the silo of activism how politically correct and how radical we are and so on, with very little thinking about where people are. And so the last thing I would say is we have to really to shift people and to bridge people, to build bridges. We have to recognize that culture drives politics. Politics does not drive culture. And therefore, one of the additionalities we need in activism today is what I would call energizing artivism, bringing the worlds of arts, culture, and activism together, because if we are to reach people in the heart and move them, we're never going to be able to do that unless we speak through the culture that, and Maya Angelou once said, you might not remember if somebody asked you what's the best book, the best movie, the best poem you read. You might not remember the details of it, but what you remember is how it made you feel. And if we think we're going to shift people by being very intellectual and jargony and putting thoughts in their mind, then we are deluding ourselves in terms of how we can build bridges with those that are not with us. But we have to start with recognizing that those folks are our brothers and sisters. They are the ones who have been misled and have landed where they are by opportunistic politicians, and we must make plans to win them over. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumi. I want to switch gears to thinking ahead, to maybe have a vision a bit for the future. So, Lyla, I want to put to you a question that someone had submitted to us in advance, and I'm going to read it here. When you imagine current or future examples of communities that do not perpetuate the polycrisis and are regenerating life around them, what tools, technologies, and inventions do you see used in daily life, and what do you not see? For both Native people and non-Native people, what do you think life in Turtle Island might look like?
Well, the great thing is we don't need to entirely reinvent the wheel. There's so many systems here that fed millions and millions of people. That's another one of the misconceptions about Indigenous peoples here in Turtle Island, or also known as North America, is that there weren't very many of us, right? We're just like little sparsely half-naked Native Americans running around trying to build a fire with 2 sticks. That's a colonial narrative meant to denigrate the hundreds and hundreds of unique civilizations that were all across this continent. And so these systems fed huge amounts of people. I mean, let's just take one example. Tenochtitlan, right? Mexico City was a city built on a lake out of reeds and mud and regenerative aquaponics. A city built on top of a regenerative reed-based aquaponic system. So Lake Texcoco was this huge lake, since been drained for Mexico City, but you have huge populations, huge city centers. You know, it was like the New York City of its time, living on a lake without polluting the water. Interesting. Your shit was so valuable that you could take it to the market and trade it. That's how advanced the sewage system was. You could trade it for goods because they found a way to transform human manure into a very, very valuable asset, which fed entire communities. Your urine was also saved and sold and traded in the market, as it was a very valuable formant, or a thing that brings dyes into textiles and sort of fixes it onto the textile. It's incredible, you know, like the technologies, we don't have to look very far, and these so-called primitive people had extraordinary systems, and in some cases these systems still survive. So that's sort of a grandiose example. I know it's hard to be like, okay, well, let's just recreate Lake Texcoco. And I know we're dealing with more things now than our ancestors were. You know, we have nuclear waste now. We have, you know, all of the American rivers being polluted. We have these factories that we're going to have to dismantle. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but I'm saying the technologies are already there. And what really needs to shift actually is that value system. So I'll give a few more technologies, and then I'll explain why none of those are really the real point. So another thing is augmenting the base. So that's a technology or a strategy that a lot of Native nations use. So for example, the Pacific Northwest people, they understand that the herring eggs, these little tiny eggs laid on the coastline by the silver fish, they notice that this is the caloric base of the entire ecosystem. And so what they do is they hand plant kelp forests to increase the amount of substrate, the amount of surface area that these herring can lay their eggs. They also put hemlock boughs, tree branches basically, into the water weighed down by rocks to also increase the surface area. And this is after about 98% of Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples were wiped out, right? Like wiped out, entire villages just gone. So imagine if all those people were still here doing that project of kelp forest management and hemlock bough submersion, and we had that people power back in the game. You could actually augment the caloric base. So then when the herring fish come, which they come every February, and lay their eggs, they just lay a lot more. They have a lot more surface area, and it doesn't get lost out in the sea like sometimes it does if there's not enough surface area. And so that's how we can turn our population problem into a population asset. 8 billion Homo sapiens on the planet is only a problem if they don't behave regeneratively. The moment they behave regeneratively, they actually become an asset. They actually become something good. And so let's turn our population problem into a population asset. If we get people on the ground, a lot of people say, Lyla, how are we going to do this? I'm like, well, we're complaining about all this population problem, but we're not putting any of them to work, to regenerative work, where they're not only regenerating ecosystems, but they're regenerating their own heart by getting their hands in the soil, getting out on the land, being a part of the ecosystem. And there's lots of tribal restoration projects going on that engage people in these projects. Super exciting time. So that's one technology, is to augment the base. Once the herring eggs are in full force, they are feeding the salmon, they are feeding the eagles, they are feeding the killer whales up the food chain, they are feeding the sea wolves. There are sea wolves in the Pacific Northwest. It's really cool. They actually like swim in the sea and will go eat these eggs. The bears, everyone feeds on the herring eggs. And herring is so important in Pacific Northwest culture that many of these nations, their new year begins in February when the herring come. And so when we understand to augment the caloric base of an ecosystem, we become more wise and we become more efficient. A lot of people say, oh, Lyla, that's a very cute little thing, but how are you going to feed 8 billion people? I'm like, actually, studies have been done on these indigenous food systems in Brazil based on terra preta, the anthropogenic soil management, the anthropogenic topsoil augmentation that we find throughout the Amazon, these man-made soil systems, that these farms produce twice as much protein than the colonial farm next door. And they fed twice as many people. So these systems are not just pie in the sky. They're actually incredibly productive. And you have all these stories, right, in California of there being so many salmon, you could walk across the backs of them, so many grizzly bears. And now they actually put a ban on certain salmon fishing in California this year because there's no salmon. So who's the more efficient here? Who is actually going to feed 8 billion people here? You know what I mean? Is it this system that is so efficient and has so many, monocrop, output and yield and or this other system that actually harnesses the forces of nature, lets nature do the work and simply sets things up so that when nature comes, you're ready and you're supporting it and augmenting it? That's much less hours per day that we have to work to get much more calories. They've also done studies on the Chumash estimates, and they estimate those folks did not have 5-day work weeks. They did not slave themselves to death trying to just make a living. These folks didn't have to work too much by most estimates, caloric estimates. And so these regenerative systems are all here. I could probably go through ecosystem by ecosystem, what type of technologies could actually feed large amounts of people. I mean, look at the bison. The bison were from Alaska to Pennsylvania to Louisiana to California. The bison were not just in North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana. we had a bison belt that went deep into the South. And we maintain that bison habitat by routine burning of the prairies. That opens up meadow, that injects ash into the soil. It creates nutrient-dense grasslands in its wake. And that is actually augmenting the base for herbivores. So we had millions upon millions of bison to eat and to nourish us. And the bison has always been a symbol of abundance. And that's why my dissertation is called Architects of Abundance, because we have so much power in these human hands to architect abundance for all people. And I'm sure you're asking, well, okay, Lyla, but why aren't we doing that? And that goes to my second point of why all these technologies are missing the point. The real point is the heart. I remember researching how big this system was, how old it was, what type of species did it produce for years, until I realized I was missing the point. The point is the invisible world of the human heart that cannot be measured so easily, which is our value system. That is the secret sauce that makes these systems thrive. That is the deepest technology we need to work on. And as much as we garden our outer landscapes, we need to garden our inner landscape and get that shit right. Because until that is right, all of our technologies are not going to flourish. So for example, let's say you hand this exact same clam garden where they build these intertidal rock walls, these 2,000 year-old intertidal rock walls to capture water and sediment. And they've augmented clam habitat along Quadra Island by 35% just by building these intertidal rock walls. This is an ancient Pacific Northwest technology. Let's hand this exact same technology to a capitalist. Let's hand this exact same technology to someone whose job is to maximize profits for their board and their stakeholders and their shareholders. That system's not going to last 2,000 years, I don't think. Let's take the 2,000-year-old oyster fishery of Chesapeake Bay, right? Beautiful, right? The oysters of Chesapeake Bay were long famed for being huge, and you had to cut them into quarters just to eat them. And they were so famous. And we know through evidence that indigenous peoples managed this estuary for thousands of years and never ran out of oysters. They were harvesting, eating oysters, depositing them into shell mounds for thousands of years, never ran out of oysters. Then you put it into American management, and in less than 300 years, Americans wipe out the entire oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay, and now it's less than 1% of its original population size. So it's not just about having the system. You need the heart to be able to sustain it, which again is founded on a few key things: respect, reverence, reciprocity, regeneration, relationality, and humility and kindness. That's the software, that is the program that we operate on as Homo sapiens. And so it's not our technologies, our outward manifestation, it's the software, the stuff you can't see, that really powers it and makes it either win or lose. And so I think that's a very long-winded way of saying, I will distill it into a couple of sentences, that as we envision on Turtle Island a thing that does not contribute to the polycrisis, we envision these regenerative food system technologies, but we also envision healing the human heart. And that's why I think artivism, or art in general, is so important, because art and philosophy, it gardens the realm of the thoughts, and the thoughts are where our value systems live, which then defines what our goals are as a society, which then defines our strategies on the earth, which then defines our realities. So much begins in the heart, begins in the mind, and how we see what we're doing and what is important to us. And if what is important to us is reverence, respect, reciprocity, relationality, humility, kindness, regeneration, all things like a domino effect will have a different look. And imagine if our banking system was based on respect and reciprocity. I don't think we're going to heal until we heal the heart. We could have the greatest technologies. We actually already have them. Actually, we could have the greatest ideas. But if we're still governed by the other software, which is profit maximization, building our resume, our LinkedIn profile, our self-centered, self-aggrandizing software, are maximizing self-gain in the short term, that software is just going to continue to guide us, regardless of what technologies we have, down a dead-end path. So sorry, that was a lot of words. I'm going to stop there.
Well, that was great. I like the hardware software um, analogy. We are sadly running out of time. I feel like we're just scratching the surface, and I know we've gotten some great questions from folks that we unfortunately won't get a chance to get to. I'm going to ask you to kind of close that out a little bit, Kumi, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Sorry.
That's okay.
And you have a choice here. You could either share any closing thoughts you have, or you can answer a two-part question, which is a difficult one, but I think is important, which is, what questions would you pose to people who are listening that they should ask of themselves, or a challenge that you would pose to them as they leave our conversation today?
Can I share my screen quickly?
Hopefully the technology supports it. Go for it.
You see that?
Yep.
So I think I'm trying to marry your questions to some closing comments. So I think quite often those that seek change and those that are leading movements and so on, their starting point is about how people are marginalized, excluded, oppressed, repressed, and so on. And therefore, sometimes what happens unwittingly is that we imagine that people have much less agency than they actually have. And this was an attempt on my part to try and remind ourselves, when people ask the question, what can we do? How can we get engaged and so on, is to recognize that we need to ensure that there are multiple pathways by which people can participate and make a difference. And each of I organize this in 4 quadrants. One is harnessing our autonomy, where people have powers as litigators, as citizens and voters, as shapers of our own destiny through building movements and so on. Harnessing our wealth, where people have power more than we recognize. If we can aggregate our wealth, whether you have $5 or $5 million in the bank account, doesn't really matter if you can organize people who bank in same institutions. And that's how we have stopped very many big fossil fuel projects and so on. And then, of course, we have consumptive power. If we were to be consuming some of the kinds of products that come out of what Lyla was talking about, then, we can have shifts in what is produced, because right now a lot of what is produced is what we don't need. And certainly it's produced in ways in which are not helpful. And then most importantly, I think, is harnessing our creative participation. And people have power as custodians of ancient wisdom, which is what we've talked about a lot today. People have powers as shaper of values, ethics, and beliefs, and makers of all culture and all forms of art. Now, what I would say is that in the coming decade, what we can anticipate is the global mental health crisis that we are experiencing because of partly climate anxiety and eco-anxiety, as well as the rise of fascism and all the intersecting crises, is going to challenge us, right? And I want to conclude by saying that it doesn't matter if we don't have all the answers to all the details of the questions that we need to address. We should be comfortable about embracing the notion of emergence and a culture of emergence where we can say we know that we need to reduce carbon emissions, but exactly how we're going to go step by step, what energy mix we'll have, all of those things. There should be an invitation rather than people in leadership, and I've made this mistake 1,000 times, believing that we know what the solutions are. We need invitations to people to invite them in, not just simply to participate and do what some in leadership tell them to do, but to invite them in as co-creators of the solutions moving forward. Because if we don't offer that invitation, we don't. And let me finally say that, you know, the struggle for justice is a marathon and not a sprint. And those of us who are in these conversations, if you are anything like me, there will be days that you'll wake up right now and feel literally desperate about what we read and what we see going on around us. But I just want to close by saying, when you hit those moments, just remind yourself the world would be a much more pessimistic place where it were not for people like each of you who are concerned, want to get engaged, are seeking ways in which to participate, and so on. And I wish you well in that journey of finding a space where you do it for your mental health, for your sense of community, for the quality of your own life, but also for aggregating the kind of numbers of people engaged that can make sure those in power act with the urgency that the situation calls for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kumi. We're running a little over time, but I just want to take just a couple of minutes to thank everyone for joining us today, especially Lyla, June, and Kumi for your insights. I wish we had more time together, to be honest. I also want to thank the fantastic team at Post Carbon Institute who've been working really hard behind the scenes to help organize this event. Now, before we leave, I also just want to share some information about things that we have planned coming up. There are a lot of questions that were submitted by folks that we didn't get a chance to get to that actually speak to some of the conversations that we're going to be organizing in the coming months. The first one, and you just talked about this, Kumi, was dealing with the mental health crisis that we're facing. We are going to be hosting a deep dive. In fact, there's an event in 2 weeks from today on the topic of building emotional resilience. Each deep dive, so for example, the one on emotional resilience, offers facilitated conversation with leading experts, peer discussions, recorded interviews with diverse subject matter specialists, and additional resources. The conversation we're going to have 2 weeks from today is with Tequila Chingalpa and Dr. Lise Van Susteren, followed a week later by a facilitated session with Laura Schmidt from the Good Grief Network. We're offering a $15 discount for folks who are able to sign up. That ends tonight at midnight, our time and Pacific time. So if you're interested in signing up for that deep dive, you can go to resilience.org/plus. And then in July, we're going to be exploring how to navigate climate breakdown. In October, we're going to be talking about overcoming political polarization. And in December, we're going to be exploring post-growth pathways. So stay tuned for more updates on those deep dives. And there are going to be lots of other conversations we're hoping that we can facilitate in the coming weeks and months. As I said in the beginning, we need you to be engaged in this work collectively. So whatever we could do to support you in that helps us achieve our mission here at Post Carbon Institute and hopefully change a little bit of the trajectory that we're on as a species and in the fate of many other beings on this planet. So again, thank you all for joining us, and to you, Lyla and Kumi, thank you so much for all of your work and for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Be well.
Good luck.
Take care, everyone.